Recently, I did something that seems to happen less and less frequently these days. I booted up Rust to play with my friends. I've been playing the game on and off since May of 2016, and the majority of my almost 900 hours were back then on a MacBook Air. Since the game came out of early access and I got a proper PC, I've played less and less. Maybe it's because I now have access to other games that I could never play on Mac or PS4, but Rust still remains one of my favourites that I wish I could enjoy as much as I used to. So why do I only find myself playing every few months and struggling to get my friends to enjoy it for more than a day or two? Well, one simple answer is, the game has changed. It's no longer the experience that I so fondly remember my 14-year-old self playing. Since Rust came out of early access, a lot of things have improved. There's more content, a better progression system, and far better quality of life and optimization than there used to be. The game also looks a lot better now. Or does it? Rust has gone through several major visual overhauls since it was in the form now known as Legacy, which is no longer supported. When I started playing in 2016, the game looked like this. And shortly after the XP system was released in July, the game got a major graphics overhaul in September, which was known for most of my time playing back then as the graphics update, to give you an idea of how big it was for everybody. The game looked incredible, even playing at 480p and 25 FPS on my MacBook. I was still in love with the desert oases, the dense pine forests, and the cold, brown tundras. The landscape was punctuated with huge mountains and valleys, and finding a cool spot to build in this atmospheric, post-apocalyptic world was one of my favourite things to do on the computer. When Rust came out of early access in early 2018, it received another graphics overhaul. So the game I came back to with my new PC a year later was vastly different, but it was missing something. My 1080p and solid 60 FPS couldn't make up for the fact that those wide valleys had been replaced with claustrophobic, lumpy terrain. The tundras had been replaced with desolate, white ice sheets. The dense coniferous forests made way for these dead trees and red grass. There's something about these memories of old Rust, the way the game used to look and feel, that invokes a sense of nostalgia within me. Coming home from school on a Friday night to sink hours into this rough and unpolished game at 20 FPS, and the tension from that familiar music as I loaded into the server, waiting to see if my base was still there. Nostalgia for video games is nothing new, of course, but this is an interesting case. The Rust I so fondly remember, I barely experienced. This is known as Ersatz nostalgia, or the idea of being nostalgic for something you've never lived through in the first place. See, like I said before, my computer could barely run Rust. These are screenshots I took playing back then to give you an idea of what it was like. And I played on a tiny 13-inch screen. I would lose almost every fight because of lag, or just because I sucked at the game, and after the graphics update, remember the one I mentioned earlier, I had to live in the desert every single wipe because going into the wooded areas caused me to have massive frame drops. This was my favourite game at the time, and for all intents and purposes, I was only playing in a third of it. So why am I nostalgic for the old graphics that my laptop could barely run, the old weapon metas where people would run around with crossbows instead of semi-automatic rifles? A game that was probably more fun to play vicariously through my favourite YouTubers than it was to play myself. In most cases, people, me included, would have long given up and moved on, but 700 hours later, there I was, still playing. As obvious as it may be, I think the answer is the game itself. Rust started as a DayZ clone, but over the years it has evolved into something so much different. There are some pre-built structures in the world, but the vast majority are created by players. There's nothing stopping you from shooting everyone you see on sight, but you can talk to them first, you can be kind, you can make friends, you can betray those friends, be toxic, and then paint a xenophobic sign. For better or worse, and there is some worse, those last two things I mentioned are pretty much par for the course in Rust. It's a really interesting case study into what happens when you give players complete freedom in an online world, like the popular MMOs of the 2000s never could. Because of this, the game has always had a reputation as being especially harsh to new players, and that's true now more than ever. Needing scrap and components to progress means that players are hemmed in more towards these man-made monuments. The weapons are better balanced, so it's harder than ever to upset the pecking order unless you're exceptionally skilled. The game has always been mainly about PvP, and even the new PvE events like the oil rig mainly serve to find better gear for fighting and raiding other players. And when you're having fun PvPing, oftentimes that means the person on the other side isn't. Regardless, the formula is pretty addictive. There's something about running out of your base with only a crossbow and knowing you could return with so much more. It's kept me coming back, even when my chances of winning those fights were really, really low. The main principles of Rust remain the same after all these years, and although I can now use a rifle without the muzzle flashes lagging out my computer, we still arrive back to the same question: why don't I enjoy playing as much as I used to? Yes, I don't think the world was as cool, and yes, there's that nostalgia I talked about earlier, but I think the answer is something the two have in common. The game, like I mentioned earlier, like all things, has changed. Change is good, of course, it's absolutely necessary, but as we see all the time, humans seem to be naturally predisposed to resist it. My favourite monument in Rust is still the Dome, and I realised recently that's because it's one of the only ones that is the same since when I started playing nearly 5 years ago. And if that's not case in point, I'm not sure what is. Equally as important is that I've changed too. Rust is a game that demands a large amount of time to really progress, and I'm a lot busier now than I was at 14. It's perfectly normal to move on from things, and maybe some are best left remembered, even if it is that Ersatz nostalgia in place of the real thing. Enough living in the past. It's a video game, so none of this really matters. But the same idea is just as apparent in real life too, and I think it's important to consider. It's not all doom and gloom either. I played the Rust Wipe last Friday with a group of friends and had some of the best fun I've ever had in the game, so maybe 14-year-old me isn't as far away as he feels.